They were trained to die before surrendering. But what they found inside the enemy's camp was hot water. In the final years of World War II, as the Pacific theater descended into blood and attrition, thousands of Japanese soldiers were captured and transported across oceans to American soil. Most had fought in jungles and on remote islands, places where water was rationed, disease was rampant, and comfort was non-existent. They arrived not with expectations, but with warnings echoing in their ears. The journey to the camps was long. Many were transported by ship, heads bowed, hands bound, the stench of tropical mud and blood still clinging to their uniforms. They landed in California, Texas, Arkansas, far from the islands they had defended with blind loyalty. Behind barbed wire, guarded by soldiers who spoke a language they didn't understand, these men were now prisoners in a nation they had only known through wartime propaganda. Their first days were spent in silence. Medical checks, roll calls, issued garments, food rations. But then, a strange command broke the routine. They were to enter a structure filled with pipes, drains, and metal nozzles. A shower hall. At first, they resisted. They had never seen such a place in war. Bathing had been a rare ritual, often a handful of water from a canteen or a plunge into a muddy river. Soap was a memory. Clean towels a myth. Here, guards motioned firmly for them to undress. And then, water hissed from the ceilings. Some flinched. Others froze. For a breathless moment, they feared it was punishment, not mercy. But the liquid was warm, almost soothing. Many stood still, stunned, as steam rose around them. These were the same men who had endured weeks without washing, who had fought with lice under their collars and infected wounds on their legs. Now, under the hum of industrial pipes, they felt something alien and almost terrifying: clean. That first encounter with American hygiene would not be the last. But it marked a turning point, not just in the routines of camp life, but in how these men viewed their captors. Because inside the enemy's shower room, they began to question everything they had ever believed. The showers weren't optional. Every few days, like clockwork, guards barked orders and lined the prisoners up in rows. Soap, towels, instructions through translators. And always the same command: bathe. For the Americans, it was hygiene. For the Japanese, it was confusion. Letters and whispers spread through the barracks. Some prisoners believed the routine was meant to humiliate them. Others feared it was a trick, that poison might lurk in the soap, or that the hot water was a psychological weapon, softening warriors into obedient captives. One former infantryman from Okinawa wrote years later, "We thought it was some test. No army, not even ours, treated us this cleanly. It frightened us more than bullets." The American side saw things differently. Hygiene was discipline. It was part of camp regulations, as vital as roll calls or meal distribution. Medical staff performed lice checks. Delousing powder was applied. Bedding was inspected weekly. Towels were laundered and folded. Even the layout of the camp reflected this orderly philosophy. Rows of bunks, organized walkways, scheduled lights out. To the Japanese soldiers, it felt like a machine. Cold, efficient, almost inhuman. They had come from a military culture where endurance of filth was a mark of honor. In the jungles of New Guinea or the caves of Iwo Jima, bathing was seen as a luxury for the weak. Now, in a strange twist of fate, they were forced to be clean by the very enemy they once vowed to die fighting. For the first few weeks, resentment simmered. Some men faked compliance, barely wetting their faces, skipping steps when the guards weren't looking. But failure to follow procedure often meant being sent back in. American guards, sometimes impatient, pushed them toward the nozzles again. Lather. Scrub. Rinse. Dry. The routine became inescapable. And slowly, something shifted. A quiet realization settled among the prisoners. Their skin began to clear. Wounds stopped, festering. Lice disappeared. Some men slept better. Others coughed less. They looked at each other and saw change, not just in appearance, but in posture, in breath, in the way their barracks no longer reeked of war. It was a transformation they never expected enforced by the enemy, under the watchful eyes of men in foreign uniforms. Still, unease lingered. Was this hygiene, a kindness, or was it a tactic? Were the Americans trying to break them with comfort? The questions echoed in their minds like the hiss of the shower pipes, because even as they grew healthier, they weren't sure what they were becoming. There was no battle, no gunfire, no bayonets, no blood in the mud. But for many Japanese prisoners of war, the moment they began to scrub behind their ears without being told, that was the moment they realized something had changed. What had once been a humiliation, standing naked before enemies, scrubbing their bodies with American soap, became a ritual, mechanical, familiar, almost voluntary, but it came at a cost. A former naval radio operator, captured on Guam, wrote decades later, I remember the day I stepped into the shower without fear. I felt clean and ashamed, as if I had accepted something I swore I never would. This was the turning point, because the question was no longer why are they doing this to us? It became what does it mean that we are allowing it? In Japanese military doctrine, surrender was unthinkable. Cleanliness in war was indulgence. To accept comfort in defeat was a betrayal of everything they had trained for. And yet, here they were, washing regularly, folding towels, even reminding each other not to forget behind the neck. The physical scars of war began to heal, but a deeper wound opened. Some prisoners avoided eye contact as they lined up for showers. Others muttered half prayers before stepping under the nozzles. One corporal, formerly stationed in Saipan, confessed to feeling dirtier after bathing not from the water, but from the knowledge that he had begun to prefer the order of his captors to the chaos of his comrades. Not everyone felt this way. A few hardened officers refused to cooperate. They bathed under protest. They accused others of weakness, of drifting into enemy thinking. But their words fell flat, because even they could not deny how the sores had healed, how their stomachs no longer twisted from parasites, how their skin no longer cracked from salt and sweat. The greatest sacrifice was not pride. It was certainty in the idea that the enemy was inhuman, that surrender meant degradation, that the empire's strength lay in enduring anything, even filth and infection, without complaint. Now, in rows of steaming showers, among the hiss of pipes and the clatter of flip-flops, that belief eroded day by day. The soap, thick and pungent, became a symbol of survival, of shame, of a question no one could answer aloud. If this is the enemy, what were we fighting for? By the third week, the routine no longer felt forced. Men rose at the same hour, stood in line, held soap in hand, filed into rows of metal pipes and steam. No commands needed to be shouted anymore. The showers had become part of them. And still, it disturbed many of the Japanese prisoners, not because of what was happening, but because of what wasn't. No cruelty, no punishments, no secret tortures behind the water pipes, just order, just efficiency, just discipline. One prisoner, a veteran from Peleliu, whispered to his bunkmate, we had been told that to fall into enemy hands meant dishonor, that the Americans were monsters. But monsters do not care if your feet are clean. This clash between expectation and reality shook their beliefs. The Japanese army had prized endurance. Soldiers were taught to ignore sickness. Disease was weakness. Filth was a test of loyalty. One sergeant had once marched with trench foot for 40 days without complaint. Now, that same man was seen carefully drying between his toes with a fresh towel. It wasn't because the Americans had won him over. It was because the pain had gone. Small infections disappeared. The constant itch of lice stopped. Skin grew pinker, healthier. Men coughed less, slept better, began to look for the first time in months like soldiers again, not specters. They still wore the shame of defeat, but their bodies no longer bore the grime of it. The Americans, for their part, didn't see this as kindness. It was regulation. Hygiene in the camps was not about compassion. It was military efficiency. Disease spread fast in confined quarters. Cleanliness wasn't mercy, it was control. Guards timed the showers. Medics checked for lice. Uniforms were collected, washed, returned. Blankets were laundered on schedule. Every action came with paperwork, discipline, and procedure. And that, perhaps, was the most foreign concept of all. That discipline could take the shape of care. One corporal, scribbling on a scrap of packaging, wrote, **. In our army we were told discipline meant obedience, silence, suffering. Here, discipline means soap, towels, rules that protect the body, not just command it. I do not know which is stronger. **. Some prisoners tried to resist this creeping change of thought. They muttered that this was a trick, that the enemy was using comfort to make them soft, that discipline through kindness was still control. But they followed the rules. They bathed. They scrubbed their bodies clean, because, in the end, the body remembers more clearly than ideology. It remembers pain. It remembers relief. And the steam that rose each morning inside the shower halls carried with it a strange new scent, not just of soap, but of doubt. Years later, long after the war had ended, after repatriation ships returned the men to Japan's shattered ports, they still remembered the showers, not the rations, not the labor assignments, not even the interrogations. The hot water, the lather of unfamiliar soap, the feel of thick towels against newly clean skin. The discipline of hygiene that, for some, became a memory more vivid than battle. It had been strange at first, humiliating even, but in time it became routine, and then a revelation. In post-war interviews, historians found a pattern. Former Japanese prisoners of war often mentioned bathing in captivity, not as trauma, but as contradiction. One officer confessed to his daughter decades later, **, we thought we were braver because we endured filth. But then, I saw my skin heal in enemy hands, and I began to wonder what strength really meant. **, many brought home the habits they'd learned in those camps. They taught their sons to wash their feet carefully, to never wear the same socks 2 days in a row, to fold towels and uniforms with precision. Not as mimicry of American ways, but as survival wisdom earned in silence and steam. Some carried shame, others quiet respect. But all of them remembered how the routines forced upon them by their enemies gave them something their own commanders never had: relief. In some households, the story was never told. In others, it became a strange point of reflection. A father explaining to his grandchildren why hygiene mattered not because of rules, but because of what it said about a nation's soul. One man, a former artilleryman, wrote in his memoir, **, the Americans had more soap than we had bullets, more hot water than we had rice. But what stayed with me was this: they made us clean, not to humiliate us, but to prove they could, to show that even their captives would be kept orderly. That was their strength, and in a strange way, I admired it." **, the showers, once feared as cruel tricks, became symbols of something deeper than power. They were signs of civilization, of a system so confident, so structured, it extended dignity even to the defeated. That realization stayed buried in many hearts, not discussed in post-war newspapers, not honored in public parades, but passed down in quiet routines, in the scent of soap, in the sound of running water before sleep. And, perhaps, that was the greatest paradox of World War II, that in a war fought with firebombs, starvation, and hate, the most unforgettable act of the enemy was a hot shower.